I'm Shamim Nyanda from the United Republic of Tanzania. Apart from being an activist, as I had been introduced, working with Debt for Climate, I'm also a social scientist working with the Tanzania Ocean Climate Innovation Hub as well, endorsed by the United Nations Ocean Decade in advancing ocean climate solutions in Africa, and also IOC UNESCO in ocean literacy in the African continent. And being a social scientist, it has been a great part of my life, dealing with people's livelihoods and how climate change is impacting those people's livelihoods. It has been quite a journey as a young person to see and grow up seeing all those kind of things happening. It's craziness, it's madness, it's capitalism, all those words that you just mentioned. And I would like to request maybe Matthias, if you can share the screen, please. It's just to give you a glimpse of who we are as Debt for Climate and what do we really do. And in terms of when you're talking about debt of the global north and the necessity of the united front for us in terms of against financial injustices to the global south, colonialism, and all those things that you've been able to mention, I would just next slide, please. I'll be saying that. Next slide, please. I would like to just say that why are we having this seminar, or why are we having this lecture? It is because colonialism and debt and climate injustice are deeply interconnected, and it forces the forces that really come with this is it has shaped the global economy that we are all talking about, with the environmental landscapes that do exist. And to understand today's climate crisis, we must examine how colonial histories of exploitation have really evolved into the modern day that we are living in, and has turned this into debt traps, especially for the global south countries, limiting them or giving them the inability to tackle or handle the climate crisis. And so it's very important for us to see some of these legacies of colonialism and how they have been historically and how they manifest themselves, and how it continues to be a tool of control, perpetuating the economy of the global south countries. And mostly I'll be using examples of Africa because I am from Africa, and it's much easier for me, to give like first-hand information and examples from my own continent. So in this lecture, we'll explore how debt itself acts as a barrier to climate action, particularly to the global south countries, and why this is fundamentally unjust, and what pathways do exist towards achieving the climate justice through the lens of debt cancellation. And of course, we all know loss and damage and reparations for the global south countries, but we'll mainly focus on debt cancellation in this lecture. Next slide, please. Yes, so I would like to, and this was one of my questions that I was going to ask you, but I'm happy that it was asked before we could start the session. What do you feel when you hear the word debt and debt crisis and debt cancellation, and what is that particular word that comes to your mind? And these are the things that really comes to most of the people that I've been interacted with or had workshops with or conversations with regarding debt cancellation and the debt crisis. And most of them, whenever they hear the word debt, what comes to their mind is the GDP ratio, the debt crisis itself, the financial institutions, the bilateral institutions, multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. Those are mostly the things that really come to their minds or their heads in the context of how do we understand the debt crisis itself, and why does it exist in the first place, and how does that really impact us as communities, as countries, as individuals. Next slide, please. And so from the intimidation perspective to resistance. So when you think about all those words that you've been able to mention, you mentioned capitalism, you mentioned colonialism, and that is more of an intimidation. It comes from the intimidation factor that I feel like I'm responsible. I feel like my ancestors are responsible. But we have to move beyond that feeling of responsibility, beyond that feeling of, I'm entitled to do this. I'm entitled to provide the solutions, and come towards how do we unite and how do we work together as the global north and the global south for us to be able to beat the unjust financial colonialism that exists in the first place. And why does it exist? Next slide, please. And why am I talking about this? We have so many figures globally that have been advocating and have been assassinated simply because they talked about debt cancellation for the global south countries, simply because they stood up and said enough is enough and we need debt cancellation for the continents of Africa, Latin America. And one of those figures that we in fact celebrated a few days ago, which is who is Thomas Sankara, he spoke and talked about a united front against debt. And you know what happened immediately after his speech? He was assassinated for talking about the debt cancellation of the African countries in order for them to talk about their own development, to talk about their own leverage and how they move forward as a continent. So it's for us to understand that debt is a Pandora's box that we are trying to open, and many people are not happy with it, because what happens when the debts of these countries are cancelled? It means they're going to be independent. They're going to try to start thinking about their own development, their own personal well-being, their own climate crisis within their own spaces. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so why a united front against debt in the 21st century? We might think about it in a way that why are we even talking about this thing, and why should we focus on debt cancellation for the global south countries? To begin with, these countries didn't even contribute to the climate crisis that we are experiencing at the moment. When you look at the fourth industrial revolution and how it happened, it never happened in Africa, it never happened in Latin America, but we are the ones that are really facing the hard part of it, because we are part of one planet, and that planet exists because of that. And you find that most of the countries of the global south have, are critically indebted, and we are looking at 40 of which are critically indebted. And of course, this is the whole perspective for you to understand that you can always go back and read and understand what do we mean when we talk about critically indebted to the IMF and World Bank. I'm talking about the multilateral institutions, the Bretton Woods institution that is also one of the greatest contributors to the loans that are being given to the global south countries, particularly looking at Africa, but also looking at the GDP of these countries and how is this really contributing. For instance, sub-Saharan African countries are estimated to have taken on an additional $996 billion in debt over the next 10 years. That is going to happen because they need to tackle the climate crisis. And how can they tackle it? They cannot do it without resources. They cannot do it without money. And what happens? They end up taking these debts and loans from these multilateral institutions that are also willing to give it to them, so that when they fail to pay, they take over their natural resources. Next slide, please. And so when we try to compare the maps and what exactly you see on this slide, where you see the greener part of it, these are countries that have been under the European control. And these countries that have been under the European control, none of them has really contributed to the climate crisis. For instance, Africa alone contributes 3.8% to the greenhouse gases, yet it's the most vulnerable. And when you look at to this other side where you have red and green, it's the historical responsibility for the climate breakdown. It is the European countries, it is the USA, it is, the United Kingdom. These are countries that are far much responsible to the climate crisis that has happened over the years that we have lived on this planet. Next slide, please. And of course, yes, colonialism has caused the climate crisis. It has caused the climate change that we are experiencing currently. But then why should I talk about us uniting in order for us to talk about all these issues, in order for us to coexist with one another? Because we need each other. We need the indigenous communities. We need the activists like myself and maybe some of us in this meeting, in order for us to be able to combat the climate crisis, but also in order for us to be able to have one voice to speak against debt in the global south countries. Next slide, please. Of course, we have the systematic changes and debt cancellation. In the ancient world, all revolutionary movements had single program: cancel debts and redistribute the land. And when I talk about this, I look at the Jubilee, and I think 2025, we'll be celebrating the Jubilee Year, which happens after every 25 years. And one of the main themes of the Jubilee Year is to always cancel the debts of the most indebted countries in order to leverage them, in order to make sure that they also contribute to their own personal development. And so in this world, we are talking about the systematic changes when it comes to debt cancellation, and how can that really be done, and how can it be delivered in order for us to foresee what are the key problems that coexist. For instance, you look at a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's amongst the first richest countries in terms of natural resources globally, but yet it's amongst the third poorest countries in the world. Why do we have such things existing in this context? Because the Democratic Republic of Congo had to pay back the debts that were accumulated by their former colonizers, which was Belgium. Belgium took the loan and they're like, yeah, colonialism is ending. And for me, I usually tell people, I don't believe that colonialism ended because it was, a crime against humanity. No, it is because people ran out of money, people ran out of resources. And the only way for you to deal with something, for instance, if your project runs out of money, what happens? Sometimes we end the project. Sometimes we don't continue with these projects because we do not have the resources and the capabilities of doing it, or the capabilities of us being able to contribute. And that is how colonialism era came to an end, because people are out of resources and they now started to see it as a crime against humanity. And they left these countries into debt because they had accumulated debt. They were taking debts from the IMF, the World Bank, in order for them to be able to continue their own colonialism into these particular countries. Next slide, please. And where does all this come from? I was supposed to say next slide and I forgot. So I was just giving an example of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the colonial legacy of debt itself and how it has been into existence. It all draws us all back to the colonial era. And sometimes I tell my friends from the global north that it is not your responsibility because you are not there even when these things were happening. It is our ancestors. But then how do we make the difference? How do we make it different from what our ancestors did? And I feel like we are still not making the difference. We are not uniting. We are not working together to demand for debt cancellation of these countries that was accumulated by our own ancestors into these countries. And for us to be able to do that, we need to unite. Next slide, please. We need to unite in order for us to work together. We need to unite in order for us to talk about what exactly is happening. Debt is historic and systematic and strategic. Why do we need debt? I give you debt, you fail to pay, I take what I need. They have agreements. Colonial powers took on loans to exploit the global south, as I was saying. For instance, Tanzania was colonized by the Germans, the British came. And so what happened is that they exploited these countries and then debts transferred to former colonies. So what was owed by the British and the Germans to Tanzania was to be paid by the Tanzanians themselves that didn't even take part in this loan that was taken by their former colonizers. Next slide, please. And as I was saying, indigenous communities have really been suffering the whole part of it, and how debt has been very strategic into land exploitation, taking the land of these communities, and of course also thinking about exactly in this space who owes who in terms of debt, who owes who in terms of colonialism, and how can we talk about the financial systems themselves that have been put in place by the global north countries towards the global south countries. I'm going to quickly give you an example. For instance, France colonized, we have 14 francophone countries in Africa. Those countries were colonized by the French. And what happened? The French came to these countries and said, we want to control your money. That is what I'm going to say. We want to control your money because we know you Africans cannot manage your money. So we need we need you to start saving your money in France, and all those kind of things. And then when these African countries, one of them being Mali, were against these systematic changes that were being brought by the French to their countries, do you know what the French did? They put concrete into their water systems. So the Malian people didn't have access to water for 6 months because the French felt intimidated. Like, how can you people not do what we want? And that is how, debt and colonialism has been ongoing, because if I do not do what the French are saying, I become the problem, I become the enemy. And that is how even it's steering up the wars that are happening in the global South countries. Next slide, please. And so we look at the whole systematic changes, and of course looking at the unequal exchange. In the year 2015, for instance, the North net appropriation for the South totaled to $12 billion, tons of raw materials, and 822 million hectares of land that was necessary for the production of goods and services. And everybody is saying Africa, for instance, is the only livable continent with 76% of its natural resources still intact, but yet it's the most vulnerable. And how do they continue exploiting these natural resources? By making us being indebted to them in order for us to be able to say, okay, if Tanzania cannot be able to pay back their debt to the IMF or the World Bank, what happens? Then we take off the Serengeti National Park, we are going to conserve it on your behalf, or we take off Mount Kilimanjaro and we're going to keep it intact on your behalf. That is what exactly is going on, particularly for the African countries, because of their natural resources. Next slide, please. So colonialism has never ended, as I was saying, but it just transformed. As I said, it just transformed and turned into something else. Colonialism was more like from slavery to coming and, directly continuing exploiting these countries and their natural resources. And then they're like, oh, guys, this is a crime against humanity. We don't want to do it. So they stopped, and now they turned into debt traps. They give debts to these countries. Next slide, please. So what is the connection between the climate crisis and debt itself? Let's look at that. Next slide. Debt creates the compulsion to generate foreign currencies. Imagine 2,900 Tanzanian shillings is equivalent to €1. And yet we are the ones with the actual gold reserves. Those are some of the questions that we have been asking ourselves. What if we decide as the continent of Africa and say we are closing all our natural gold reserves to the global north? What is going to happen? And they're making sure we do not do that by giving us more debts and more debts and more debts and more debts. And so exemplifying the relation between the climate and the debt crisis, we look at the direct subsidies by the World Bank and the IMF on which went to the fossil fuels, but also debt is preventing financing for adaptation, because Africa, honestly, we cannot talk about mitigation. Mitigation is there, but not as high as adaptation. So we need to talk about adaptation measures and adequate responses to environmental disasters due to the prioritization of debt service. E.g., we look at Pakistan floods, in 2022, where we're talking about a third of Pakistan being underwater, but yet still people are sitting and discussing about Pakistan itself and no solutions. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the examples that we are trying to look at. Maldives and these countries face huge costs of the climate adaptation and mitigation. But in order for us to be able to fund these, they often have to take a significant debt, creating a cycle of borrowing repayment that harms long-term sustainability and sovereignty. So for instance, if I borrow, let's say, I'm going to use your example. If I borrow, let's say Matthias, let's say $100,000 loan, and I use it, I'm unable to pay it, I'm going to go to maybe Max, borrow another one, pay Matthias. That is what exactly is happening. So there's that cycle that has been created. If I cannot pay, I borrow the IMF, I pay back the World Bank wants me to pay back, I go to China private lenders, I borrow China, I pay back the World Bank, China wants back them. And so that is this cycle that has been created for these countries. Next slide, please. And that is Suriname. That is also another example of economic constraints, which has been often exacerbated by debt, which has driven these issues. And of course, you have these slides, you'll be able to read through and understand how much money has been able to be that has been taken into debt for these countries. And next slide, please. We look at the economic constraints. For instance, we look at the Aswan High Dam, which is with its largest infrastructure project, which often requires substantial borrowing for the African countries. And next slide, please. So the debt fossil fuel trap, as we look at it, that is how it happens, as I was saying from the beginning, giving an example of Max and Matthias and myself and the borrowing and giving China, World Bank, IMF. So there's high debt burdens for these countries, and they take in more debt, until the governments have to turn to fossil fuels to generate more revenue in order for them to be able to repay back their debts. And huge investments are required, and expected financial returns fail to materialize. That is the whole cycle and the problem that is really happening for these countries. Next slide, please. So this is just for your further reading, for a tale of two emergencies and what exactly is happening, and how movements are working together to demand for debt cancellation and debt and the climate crisis as a perfect storm that is happening at the moment, at this era. Next slide, please. And I was saying from the beginning how the climate crisis and debt is related. For instance, we look at the land grabbing and debt itself. I spoke about initially the Democratic Republic of Congo. You look at the deforestation, and how it has been growing up. And also in the Himalayas, and how has that been growing up for these countries, because they fail to pay up their debts, and so they have to give out their natural resources to their indebtors or to their debtors and lenders. That is what is happening. And our next slide, please. It's also about land grabbing and debt, and how land has been grabbed in Africa. When you look at that map, you'll be able to understand how land grabbing is really taking place rapidly, and particularly focusing on Africa, and how agriculture and agricultural business and debt is correlated as well. And next slide, please. From subsistence agriculture to cash crop agribusiness. Imagine Africa, we are the ones with 76% of our natural resources still intact. We produce the food, but our people are dying of hunger. Where does our food go to? To the global north. Next slide, please. Because we signed a treaty, we signed a deal that we have to do this and that. We have to pay back our loans. We have to do this. So that is what is really happening. And next slide, please. So on this slide, we are going to talk about the social injustice and debt and human rights violation, and how has this been happening. And so with the human rights violation, next slide, please. With the human rights violation and debt, we look at the cobalt mining, lithium mining, the iPhones that you are having, the Apple products that you are having. This is how they're being mined in the Congo. This is how people are being used to mine those products that we are using in the Congo, because Congo to some point has signed some agreements with some country in the global north that you have to deliver, that they have to deliver. And because they do not have the labor, they do not have the resources. Most of us, including myself from Africa, I do not have access to a health insurance. I even don't know how it looks like, because they are very, very expensive in our countries for us to be able to afford to have a health insurance. So we just get sick, and if you get better, it's well and good. If you die, it's also well and good. So that is how debt has turned our countries to look like. Next slide, please. Neither social or ecological. So we also have activists all over the world that have really united, that have really spoken up, that are being forced to migration. So migration is also another thing that we are looking at. And Europe is one of the continents that is really battling and struggling with migration, because these people have no choices but to rather move to better, they call them greener pastures. But how green are these pastures that they are looking into? Because they cannot continue surviving in these indebted countries that they call home. And that happens to be that they have to move out and go to other places. Next slide, please. And forced migration has been another, it has been another thing that is the trend of the day. And we need to see how does that also relate with debt. It really relates to the debt crisis, and we'll be able to read about it and understand. Next slide, please. We also talk about the consequences of debt in terms of the garment industry in Bangladesh, and how the production is being done. There's no safety for the workers. They're being paid low wages for the production of the fashion industry. The fashion industry is also coming up, and how that is also correlated to debt and debt cancellation for the global south countries. Next slide, please. And here we look at the consequences of debt. We look at debtocracy. And under debtocracy, we talk about the heteronomy through debt neocolonialism, the global regime of extractivism. We look at the land grabbing, exploitation, displacement, human rights, exploitation, and forced migration, all those problems that I have been talking about. And that is why we need to call for a united front against debt cancellation in the 21st century. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this was meant for us to really have a kind of an exchange in small groups, but I think we just move on for me to quickly finish because I'll be done in 3 minutes. Let's go to the next slide until the slide that says who is responsible. Yes. So who is responsible of all these problems that we're experiencing as the Global South countries? Next slide, please. The responsible people, I don't know if you've heard about the IMF, the World Bank, all those kind of multilateral institutions, Bretton Woods institution, and the private creditors like private banks, asset managers such as BlackRock, bilateral creditors like governments, which is China, India, Germany, the Paris Club. So and of course, what about Germany? Why do we talk about Germany when it comes to the responsibility in terms of complicity? Because when you look at the Second World War and the First World War, and particularly the Second World War, Germany was one of the countries that was really affected by the war. And it's a history that I love sharing and talking to people about. And why do we call for debt cancellation? And why do we hold Germany responsible for the debt cancellation of the Global South countries? First, because Germany is among the 4th voting powers in the IMF and World Bank. It holds that position. And then the second thing is because the second main thing is because before, during, and after the Second World War, Germany's debts were cancelled. And the people that advocated for the cancellation of the Germany's debt were countries of the Global South, such as Zimbabwe, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those were countries that stood up and said, you know what, the war has happened and we need to help our friends, because without that, Germany would not have seen its sovereignty that it sees now, or it enjoys now as, you know, as a G7 country or as a 4th IMF or World Bank voting power, without that debt cancellation to Germany. And that is why we talk about Germany. That is why we take that kind of responsibility of Germany being a key role player into the cancellation of the Global South countries. If the debts of the country such as Germany were cancelled, then it's easy for other countries from the Global South to cancel these debts. But Germany, in the other hand, is not ready to stand up and, you know, speak about debt cancellation for the Global South countries, except activists like you and myself and people like you and myself that are really demanding for this. Next slide, please. So what about, I already explained to you about this responsibility in terms of complexity, at it being the 4th largest voting power in the IMF, but also the representation of Mr. Christian Lindner, also the representation in, I usually don't know how to pronounce that name, very skilled, that one. So yeah, that is how we hold Germany responsible. Next slide, please. And in terms of historical responsibility, as I was always explaining to you, is that 50% of West Germany's debt, which had been accumulated before and during and after the Second World War, were cancelled on February 27th of 1953. So this is the basic for its post-war economic development, and not a miracle, as people put it. It was not a miracle for Germany to be where it is right now. It is because countries stood up and said, we need to cancel the debts of Germany. Next slide, please. Holding those in power responsible and accountable for debt towards the Global South. This is what we do. We demand, we meet these leaders, we speak to them, we have conversations with them. For instance, on this video, and be able to play it later, this is one of our activists addressing to the German Finance Minister, Christian Lindner, and, you know, trying to have these conversations of debt cancellation. Next slide, please. Here, I'm going to be quick because this is about us as Debt for Climate as a movement. The first part was the historical part of why do we talk about debt cancellation in the first place, and how does it really relate to climate crisis, and how does it contribute to the unjust things that are happening all over the world. Who is Debt for Climate? When you go to our website, next slide, you'll be able to read about us. It's a women-led global grassroots movement from the Global South for the Global South, which unites feminist, labor, indigenous, ecological struggles, people like you and myself, in order to demand for debt cancellation. Next slide, please. These are some of the things that we have been able to do on Date for Climate. And of course, what is next is we are looking at mobilizations. And right now, as I'm speaking, next slide, please. As I'm speaking, we are having the October mobilization actions that are happening. We had the Indigenous Resistant Day that we did actions. And now we are on Thomas Sankara Day, who is one of the people that was assassinated because he spoke about debt cancellation. And next slide, please. We have a strategic horizon. We are looking at the Jubilee year 2025 and COP30 in the Amazon. And so we are mobilizing people like you and myself to be able to join this strategic movement in demanding for debt cancellation for the Global South countries. And of course, I invite you, you can always join our different working groups. We have social media, we have interpretation, we have research. There are different working groups that we have that you can be able to join and learn more and understand more about debt cancellation. Next slide, please. And thank you very much for listening to me. And you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. That is what Thomas Sankara said, and that is what I would like to leave you with. And of course, wait for questions. Thank you very much.